on global energy security and diplomacy, as well as promotes U.S. interests to ensure energy resources are used to increase economic opportunity, stability and prosperity around the world. We've provided a perfect segue into your presentation. Welcome to the Wilson Center. Thank you so much for coming out here, and the podium is yours.
Thank you, and my apologies for being a couple of minutes late, but I'm glad I caught the presentation under Secretariat. It was a very impressive presentation, but also a reminder of the great efforts that Mexico has been doing. Thank you, Duncan, for having me, and I think you're right, the segue could not have been better. I think as we look at the presentation that we just saw, and the critical work that's been done over the last couple of years in Mexico, it begs the question that as we cooperate, how do we broaden the aperture? How do we broaden that lens to look at this as a region? And let me put the context in which I see all of this. We are in a transformative, revolutionary time in energy writ large. We are living through what I believe is an era in energy that will be taught for decades to come. We are seeing coincidental transformation happening across the entire spectrum of energy. From oil, where we had a relatively limited number of country producers that were controlling the market, both within a cartel and without, to now where we've seen somewhat of a democratization of the oil and gas market, where we have new producers coming online, a declining U.S. Becoming a resurgent U.S., but that's not only true in the United States, it's true across the globe, where new producers at smaller and medium volumes are coming on the market and not wanting to listen to anybody else's rules, but say, I want my seat at the table as a producer. And I would like to look at it from a market perspective rather than a geopolitical one when I decide how much I'm going to produce or how little I will produce. That's true in natural gas, obviously, but it's also true in renewable energy. And while we see these great headlines across the financial newspapers and the mainstream press about oil price drops 60%, natural gas drops 50%, etc. We don't see as many of the headlines, but they should be there. They're just as important, of the significant reduction in price of renewable energy and solar and wind, and the ability to harness geothermal, and new technologies that are coming on board in the electricity markets, in the off-grid as well as microgrids and so on. And the utilization of that is expanding. And efficiency rates, which we don't talk enough about, but it's the best way to do more with less. And that's the first dollar you save is actually on efficiency. So across the board, we're seeing in the energy sector this transformation, while the geographic consumer base is changing. So as the demand used to be driven entirely by the OECD countries, we've seen that flip for the first time in history and probably for the foreseeable future, where the non-OECD countries are going to be driving that demand. And that has great implications. The same is true on the supply side, as I said before. So people talk about this as, a U.S. revolution, where we've seen the shale gas revolution followed by a shale oil revolution, followed by a massive investment in renewable energy and integration that far outpaced any of the expectations and projections just 3-4 years ago, where we're completing a transformation from going from coal to gas in our electricity market, and for the first time actually using more gas than coal this past just a few months ago. So these are real transformative mechanisms that are happening, developments that are happening in the United States. But I don't believe this is a U.S. story. I believe this is a North America story. And we have to start looking at things not as individual countries, what's happening in the United States, what's happening in Canada, what's happening in Mexico, and we have to start looking at this as a region. And this is a North America revolution, and I think Vice President Biden said it well when he said that North America is the epicenter of energy for the world in the first half of the 21st century. I think that really is true. And it used to be that whenever the OPEC guys met, you'd have everybody with bated breath waiting in New York and London. What will the wise men come out and tell us about our economies? But they're actually more interested today in what's happening in Mexico City, what's happening in the United States, what's happening in Canada, and how we all work together. And if we can make and take advantage of this opportunity, what that will do. That's where the news is being generated. So this is a great opportunity. And why is it a great opportunity? Because there are 300 million people in the middle class in Central America. And that's what a great opportunity looks like. It's a hemisphere that's endowed with, oil, gas, diverse and rich array of renewable energy resources, from geothermal that we just talked about in Mexico and Central America, and hydroelectric power, which is dominant in Canada, but also a big story in Central America, which also leads you into what the challenges that this region faces. Because as we talk about hydro, climate change is making that a complicated resource, where you have a couple of years of good rainfall, and we don't see a need for reform or change in the governmental structures, and then you have a few years of droughts, and everybody's crying, we got to do something, and before we get anything done, we have a good rain year, and now we're back to, well, maybe those decisions can wait a little bit, and I'll get to that. And the low oil prices that have helped fuel some progress and change in the region, are not guaranteed to come. The same guys and women in the investment banking world who wrote the notes in June, July of 2014, where they said, quote, $100 oil is the new floor, are the same exact people who wrote 6 months later, we don't see $60 as a floor. And we, in fact, saw it go down even further. So oil prices, I'm asked a lot about what's your prediction on what will happen to oil prices, and beyond saying that if I knew that, I'd be wearing a more expensive suit and I'd have a different job. But the only thing I can guarantee is whatever the price is today is not what it's going to be. It will be lower, it will be higher, and that's the nature of a commodity market, especially a volatile commodity market like the oil markets have always been and will always be. So why am I having this conversation? Why are we having this conversation? Because in the region, in Central America, you have 7 countries that combined are about, the power sector of all 7 countries combined is about the size of the state of Maryland. That's very small. And you can't expect to attract new investment at the scale that ministers often talk about, or the press wants, or the people demand, when you divide that state of Maryland up into 7 independent markets. It's very difficult to make the economic case, the business case for that. What it calls for is coming together, is joining forces and becoming a regional market that can attract that kind of investment. And that's the key. Because what we're trying to say with 300 million people in the middle class is, how do you grow the economy? That's the bottom line. How do you create better future? But you cannot, nothing is more fundamental to economic growth than energy. Nothing is more fundamental than being able to have access to reliable and affordable sources of power. I'm not going to start a business if I don't know if I'm going to be able to flip the switch in the morning. There's no chance. So I have to be able to have a stable energy market that is able to also grow. And that's why it's so critical that we come together to do this. So how do you do that? In the last few years, we've started to see what it could look like if countries come together. So in Central America, we saw the last several years working on the establishment of a regional electricity line that runs from Guatemala to Panama, CPAC, which took an enormous amount of work. And because getting it right is extremely difficult, you have to get policies, regulations, and technical issues, and all this with several different government structures, political systems, national laws that all have to be done. But it got done. And that meant that the trade tripled just in the last 2 years. But it's nowhere near enough. That's a great, fantastic first step. The problem is that this market is mainly being used as an emergency backup system, by and large, and not as an actively traded electricity